recorded.
Well, I've already indicated to him that,
fantastic. Okay.
It's
All right. Thanks, Patrick.
Okay, looks like we're recording. So we better get started. I've been working on talks regarding insight in general, but more recently been focusing on anattā, not self. And so I've been playing around with this, and tonight's talk is a combination of two other talks. I'm kind of putting things together and trying to get something that might actually work. So this is what we're going to do tonight, and my apologies in advance. It is a bit technical. So put on your seatbelts, button up, and we'll get started. Now, if anybody has any questions, please just unmute and ask. Or Liz, if you see somebody raise their Zoomic hand, let me know, because I might be buried in my notes and not notice it. Okay, so the title is Exploring Not Self. So we're going to look at the Buddha's teaching of not self, but we're going to try to put it into context, historical context. So we're beginning with his background, because when you look at his career as a practitioner, he was trained in a tradition that taught self, in Sanskrit, atman. And this is what the term he would have been familiar with. And only after his awakening, he rejected the concept of atman in favor of not atman, or in Pāli, anattā, or in, so anātman in Sanskrit, anattā in Pāli, not self in English. So he's trained in a tradition where self is at the center of the whole enterprise. And then he flips it around and teaches the opposite. Why? Something's going on. So this is what we want to have a look at first. So we begin with the Bodhisattva. The Bodhisattva is the Buddha before he becomes the Buddha. So this is what we'll call him. So as a young man, he decides to renounce home and search for awakening. So if he's going to go on a search, where to go? Now, he lives in the city of Kapilavastu, which was the capital of the Shakya Republic. And this city lay on the main east-west trading route between the kingdom of Kosala to the west, with its capital at Savatthi, and to the east, the Vajji Confederacy, to the southeast, more accurately. And it had a couple of capitals, but the major one was at Vesali. Now, in both Savatthi and Vesali, those of you who are familiar with the Buddha's teaching know he spent a fair bit of time at both places, but especially Savatthi. Now, when the Bodhisattva walks out of home, he arrives at the highway. He's got a choice. He could turn to the right and head to Savatthi, or he could turn to the left and head to Vesali. So why did he turn left? So where he's going to is what in his day was the Vajji Confederacy. This is a Republican confederacy located in what is now northern Bihar state. And it was a successor state to the old kingdom of Videha. Now, Videha was smaller, the Vajji Confederacy is bigger. But the old kingdom of Videha, this is the area that he's going to. Now, Videha, for centuries, had been a major center for the yogic traditions that we know through the Upaniṣads. So it was in Videha that some of the early Upaniṣads were composed, and especially the Bṛhadāraṇyaka Upaniṣad, or the Great Forest Upanishad. And at the time of the Buddha, this area remained a place where aspiring yogis would go to study and practice Dharma. So the Bodhisattva would have been entering into an area where the Bṛhadāraṇyaka Upaniṣad is a very important text. Now, essentially, in its current form, this Upanishad is a collection of texts that preserved the teaching of the sage Yajnavalkya, who was a native of Videha. Now, Yajnavalkya is very famous as a founding teacher of the Advaita Vedanta tradition of non-dualism. So you've probably all heard of that. And he lived several centuries before the Buddha. And one of his central teachings was the doctrine of Atman Self. And for Yajnavalkya, Atman Self is the eternal blissful essence that is found at the heart of subjective experience. And the purpose of practice in this tradition is to uncover Atman and then allow it to express itself in our lives. And the way of practice is to become deeply silent. And silence in Sanskrit is muni. And one of the old titles of the Buddha is Shakyamuni, the silent one of the Shakyas. Now, when the mind falls silent, Atman is revealed. So roughly speaking, this is their way of practice. Now, the Bodhisattva joined this tradition. He trained with at least 2 teachers because we have their names recorded. These were Alara Kamala and Uddaka Ramaputta. And according to the later Buddhist tradition, they taught serenity meditation up to a high level of formless absorption. Now, without getting into the technicalities, essentially this is very deep concentration. And this may be a reference to the practice mentioned in Bṛhadāraṇyaka Upaniṣad of the silence that reveals the Atman. But it's a later Buddhist perspective on this, in which they're saying, of course it's rubbish, but it's nice rubbish, but obviously it's not genuine. But when the Bodhisattva was practicing, this was it. This was what was going on. Now, he mastered this tradition, but he then rejected it as inadequate. And then he moves south of the Ganga to the kingdom of Magadha. Now, this is South Bihar, contemporary South Bihar state, south of the Ganges. And in particular, he moved to the area around the city of Gaya. And this was a district known for powerful and restless spirits and for the shamans who dealt with them. It's still known for that, by the way. And here, the Bodhisattva practiced independently without a teacher. And the practice that he took up was extreme asceticism. So this is the second phase of his practice career. That failed dismally. And then he developed his own way of practice, which he called the middle way. And through this, he gained awakening. He becomes the Buddha. So why is this relevant to our understanding of not self, anattā, or anātman? So the point is that Atman Self was central to the Bodhisattva's training and practice. And then once he's awakened and he becomes a teacher in his own right, instead of teaching Atman, which everybody would expect, he teaches anātman, not Atman. In Pāli, anattā. In other words, he taught the opposite of what he had been taught. And this was shocking and scandalous to his contemporaries and for many people since then. In fact, it's still for people today. Some Indians who like to look back at the Buddha as being one of the greatest Indians still can't wrap their heads around the fact that he rejects Atman. It's still a problem. So why did he take this contrary path? What problem did he see in the Atman doctrine? So this is the background that we're looking at. Any questions thus far? This is the historical bit. Before we plunge into the philosophical bit. And then after that, we get to something possibly relevant. Okay, let's move on then. So let's look at Atman in this Upanishadic tradition, because this is what the Buddha means when he talks about self. This has two aspects, which is something that we tend to miss. We tend to slide these two together. But the Atman is both metaphysical and it is psychological. So metaphysical, philosophical, and psychological. It's metaphysical in that Atman transcends the person. So, for example, in this tradition, if we ask the simple question, how many Atmans are there in the world? How many selves are there in the world? The answer is just one. There's one single Atman that transcends all individual differences and therefore transcends ordinary empirical experiences. Yet, how is this Atman to be found? And how is it expressed in one's life? So it's found and expressed through the ordinary empirical person. In other words, Atman is also psychological. And in a sense, you could say that the psychological Atman is the route to the metaphysical Atman. How do we find this transcendent Atman? We go through the physical self, into the mind. And it's the psychological Atman is the instrument through which this metaphysical Atman is expressed in the world. So it's expressed through the person. So we have a metaphysical Atman and a psychological Atman, two aspects of the teaching. Now this metaphysical Atman pops up in different beliefs, in different traditions. So for example, in Hindu traditions that believe in rebirth, or what's the term? I forget. Life after life. It's the Atman that is reborn. So the Atman just cruises along while bodies and minds come and go. Of course, Christianity is an Atman tradition. And here, Atman is the soul, and it's the Atman, the soul, who goes to an eternal reward in heaven or an eternal punishment in hell. So these are beliefs built around the metaphysical Atman. The psychological Atman is the one who acts, the one who reaps the results of action, the one who is aware of the world. So this is the ordinary everyday self who identifies as the one who acts, the one who possesses such things as a body and a mind, the one who is in charge of his or her own actions. So this is the psychological Atma. Does that distinction make sense? Any questions about that? Okay. So, first of all, the Buddha rejects the metaphysical teaching of Atman. So why does he do that? And basically because this metaphysical Atman is not empirical. Yajnavalkya raises the problem in Bṛhadāraṇyaka Upaniṣad of how we can experience Atman, or rather, how we can be sure that Atman even exists, given that it is transcendent. He says, you cannot see the seer from seeing. You cannot hear the hearer from hearing. You cannot think the thinker from thinking. You cannot know the knower from knowing. It's a very famous passage. Now, to get a sense of what he's talking about, ask yourself the question, what is the one thing we cannot see? Now, it is a trick question, but think about it. What is the one thing you cannot see? Well, the answer is we cannot see our own eyes. We can see the reflection of our eyes in a mirror, but we cannot see our eyes. Why not? Because sight proceeds out from our eyes. So whatever we see is not our eyes. Now the atman, the metaphysical atman, lies behind our seeing because it is the one who sees. So this means that whatever we see is not atman, not self, because it's not the one who resides behind seeing. Everything we see, hear, think, or know is not atman, not self. And in this, you can see that he agrees with the Buddha. Or you could say the Buddha agrees with Yajnavalkya. Does that make sense? But Yajnavalkya does believe in Atman. So how does this work? If we come back to the example of seeing, we cannot see our own eyes. But does anybody seriously suggest that this means we do not have eyes? We know we have eyes because we do, in fact, see. So, in other words, we infer the existence of our eyes without ever seeing them. We know we have ears because we do, in fact, hear, and so on. So for Yajnavalkya, the Atman, the self, is the one who sees, the one who hears, the one who smells, tastes, touches, knows. The Atman is the one who experiences. So since it is obvious that we experience, then it is equally obvious that there is one who experiences. So while it's true that we do not directly experience Atman, we know Atman is real because Atman is what makes experience itself possible. There is experience, therefore there must be one who experiences. So Yajnavalkya infers the existence of the knower, the Atman, because we know, even though we can never know the knower. And this is the basic stance of the Atman tradition. Does that make sense? If somebody taught you this, would you get a sense of what they're talking about?
Can I just ask, Patrick, is it a bit like, that Christian thing? I mean, I am not religious at all, but you know how people believe that there's God and that, God's experiencing life through us. Is it that same principle?
Exactly that same sort of thing, the same sort of logic.
Yeah, okay.
So this argument from Yajnavalkya would be fit perfectly into Christian theology, Muslim theology, etc., etc. Yeah.
Patrick, what's your opinion on, say, for example, the headless way practices of Douglas Harding as a way of getting that sense of the seeing and then what is, is that a useful way in, do you think?
I think that's he's coming out of that Upanishadic tradition. I mean, he might not have known about it, but that's what Yajnavalkya is talking about.
Yeah.
Like he's somehow stumbled onto it.
Yeah.
And this is what the ancient sages in the Upanishads, that's what they figured out. It's like, yeah, that's right. It's like there's no one here, but there's something happening.
Thanks.
I think that's pretty much it. Anyway, the Buddha will have none of this. He will not have a bar of this. There's no way, Jose. What the Buddha does, or what he does, refuses to do. He refuses to move beyond the empirical. He refuses to move beyond experience. He won't do it. In philosophical terms, the Buddha is a radical empiricist. He's interested only in the nature of human experience. Full stop. If something is beyond the range of our experience, he does not want to say anything about it. He does not say it exists. He does not say it does not exist. And this is something that got forgotten in the later traditions. Often anattā is translated as no self. But I think that's actually wrong. I think that the correct translation is not self. And the difference is, if you say no self, you're making a statement about what's out there or what's not out there. You're saying X does not exist. But the Buddha doesn't say that. He never actually says there isn't an atma. What he says is, this isn't atman. This is not atman. This experience here, that's not atman. This experience over here, that's not atman. But he never says there isn't one. He doesn't say there is one. He doesn't say there isn't one. He refuses to engage with any of that. He refuses to move beyond our actual felt experience in order to speculate about what might or might not exist. He will not make that move. And he explains this in a discourse called Sabbha Sutta, everything, where he tells his students that he's going to teach them everything. In Pāli, this is Sabbha. So we can imagine them settling in for a long talk, but it's actually very brief. The Buddha says, what is everything? Eye sensitivity and forms, ear sensitivity and sounds, nose sensitivity and smells, tongue sensitivity and tastes, body sensitivity and tangibles, mind sensitivity and phenomena. Whoever would say, I reject this everything and declare another, in other words, for example, a transcendent Atman, if questioned on the foundation of his words, he could not explain and would become distressed. Why? Because it is beyond range. So the Buddha's interested only in what lies within the range of human experience, seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, minding. Anything outside that range turns out to be bundles of words and concepts. So if we're talking about the transcendent, the only experience that we have of the transcendent, are the bundles of concepts that we use to talk about it. It turns out to be just blah, blah, blah. And when the Buddha is faced with a competing belief system, so someone who says, I reject this everything and declare another, the Buddha says, if questioned on the foundation of his words, he could not explain. Now, what the Buddha would do would typically investigate, and as the foundation of his words, he would investigate the experience this belief is based on. So what experience do you have of this, of X, whatever it is you believe in? So he would challenge the Brahmins, for example, who believed in the revelation of the Vedas. Have you actually experienced what the Vedas are talking about? What's the experience? That's a typical move that he makes. And this is why he's got no interest in the metaphysical atma. Because even according to its adherents, this atman is beyond the range of experience. So the Buddha just has no time for it. He's not rejecting it. He just is refusing to engage in it. He's not even going to waste 5 minutes talking about it. Does that make sense?
Hard here, Patrick. Just following on there. I find it really interesting the way you lay these things out. I think there was also a lot of ritual in terms of how people were to attain knowledge of the Atman as well. And I think Buddha's sort of insistence on experience seems to so trying to cut through all of that, because certain people in society were obviously claiming their knowledge of how to get there. And there's an aspect of power, I think, there. And I find Buddha's stance in terms of emphasizing direct experience is actually empowering the practitioner or the person versus empowering perhaps a certain structure that was endemic in Brahmin or Indian society at that time.
And again, it's that when he turned to the left, he really was a bit of a lefty in terms of the politics of his time, because he was a thoroughgoing Republican. And when he built his Sangha, he built it on Republican principles, self-governing communities. And this permeates through Buddhist beliefs and practices. Now, a lot of this republicanism was lost because we're not quite sure whether it was towards the end of his life or just after he died. But there was a massive war broke out in the northern Indian plain between Kosala and Magadha, which were the two of the new centralized tyrannical monarchies. And they destroyed all the republics, including the Buddha's Shakya Republic. And so India became purely monarchical, tyrannical. And so a lot of these old republican ideals died out. It survived in the Sangha in terms of the way they conducted their business. But for centuries, this aspect of the Buddha was kind of buried. But at the time, during his lifetime, it was really important. And he did see this as very important. So, for example, when he died, he refused to name a successor. He said, look, it's up to you. You people figure it out. Here's the teaching. Go for it. So he was committed to a Republican way, which by our standards, Republican anarchist, kind of community-based power structure. But that got swept away after he died. Okay, let's look at the psychological Atman. So the Buddha he doesn't have any time for the metaphysical Atman. He doesn't exactly say that it's wrong. He just won't go there. He won't say it's wrong. He won't say it's right. He will just kind of probe into it. So here we come to the psychological Atman. So why does he reject the psychological Atman? The Atman, the self that does lie within the realm of experience. So here, Atman, our sense of self, represents our fundamental point of reference. So Atman Self is the place from which we experience the world. So right now, I'm experiencing the world. Inner world of thought, feeling, etc. Outer world of seeing, hearing, and so on. Where do I experience it from? From here. And this is where the self is. So Atman is the place from which we experience the world, as well as the place from which we go out to the world. So all of us have this sense of my world is out there. So I experience the world from here, and this experience goes out there. And this is this fundamental frame of reference. This is Atman, this is self. So for example, we all have a deep sense that right now, what's happening right now is happening to me. So the me to which experiences happen is Atman. So Atman is the reference against which everything in our lives is measured. And here we're talking about the psychological Atman. Does that make sense? Does your experience happen to you? This is the Atman. This is the self. So this brings us to the problem of possession. So let's drop the philosophy And let me ask you this simple question. Does it make sense to you to think, to speak, or to act in terms of this is my body? These are my thoughts. This is my decision. Does that make sense? Would you think in those terms on a normal day? I suspect so. I strongly suspect so. So here we have Atman Self as the owner of this life. So when the Buddha looks at, well, how do we actually experience this mysterious Atman? For him, it appears first as the drive to possess. It appears as the movement, this is mine. So we take possession of our experience, and from that possession, we construct a self as the owner and the controller. Because owning and controlling go together. It doesn't make any sense to own something but not have any control over it. No, not really. If I am forced to make a decision, is it really mine? I think I'm not a lawyer, but I think the legal system wouldn't think so. And this is, I think, one reason why children are treated differently than adults. So self and possession go together. So the Buddha thinks we experience Atman very largely as the drive to possess. And this is what he calls tanha, literally thirst, usually translated craving, or we could simply call it drivenness. It's the urgent necessity to possess that matures as the movement, this is mine. So I don't know if you've noticed, but this Dharma talk is mine. For example. Now, craving, let's call it craving or drivenness, is characterized by a policy of aggressive expansion. Because when can we have enough of mine? Do we ever have enough? Economists certainly don't believe so. And if mine tends to expansion, so does Atman. And if mine tends to loss, then so does Atman. And given that possession is fundamentally insecure, then so is Atman, which makes it all very unsatisfactory. And it brings us to the teaching of the 5 aggregates, which is one of the Buddha's basic schemas for analysing the nature of human experience. And I'm sure if you've been around the Buddhist traps for any period of time, you would have heard about these 5 aggregates. So let's have a look at them. Now the 5 aggregates or what Stephen Batchelor translates as the 5 bundles. He's approaching them from a different angle from the way we're approaching it tonight. The 5 aggregates were introduced by the Buddha in his first teaching, his first discourse, Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, turning the Dharma wheel. And they're introduced as the essence of the first truth, that of dukkha. And dukkha is a technical term, traditionally translated as suffering, but it's got a much wider range of meanings. In fact, there's no exact English equivalent to dukkha. Dukkha, in its essence, is the painful emptiness we find at the center of our being, the sense of chronic dis-ease that motivates us to make things better. So, for example, why is this particular group of people sitting around attending this particular Dharma meeting? Because of dukkha. Dukkha is the source of our motivation to undertake the practice, to undertake any activity that we think will improve our condition. So in his first discourse, the Buddha analyzes the nature of dukkha from the most superficial to the deepest. And he ends with this summing up. He says, in summary, the 5 aggregates associated with clinging are dukkha. So there's a very, very close relationship for the Buddha between the 5 aggregates and dukkha. So we need to understand this connection. And that means we need to understand the link between clinging and the aggregates. The 5 aggregates associated with clinging are dukkha. So let's look at this idea of clinging, which again, if you've been around the Buddha straps, I'm sure you've heard of, clinging or attachment. Now this in Pāli is the word upadana, and it's constructed from the word dana, give or giving or gift, which of course we've talked about tonight. Giving, dana, it's the same word. So dana is giving or gift. If you put the prefix "a" in front of it, it's a long A, and this indicates toward. So dana is giving, the direction is this way. Adana is taking, bringing toward. And upa at the beginning, upadana, the upa indicates nearness, close touch, intimacy. So upadana is taking or bringing to oneself, making one's own, appropriation. So upadana, usually translated as clinging or attachment, is taking, is the action of taking as one's own. And to give an example, which we've already talked about, remember how we asked if it makes sense to you to say, this is my body. The action of taking as mine is upadana. Does that make sense? Any questions about that?
I guess I've just got a question is, whose body is it then?
That is a very good question, Evelyn.
Mm.
And I expect after a few years of intensive practice, you will be able to answer it.
Okay. You just can't tell us the answer.
Okay, well, I'll give you a clue. The answer comes when the question itself dissolves.
Okay.
When you realize it's completely pointless even asking the question.
Yeah, I was just going to say. Thank you.
Excuse me, Patrick. You said the 5 aggregates associated with clinging. This may be just a misunderstanding on my part, but are there 5 aggregates that are not associated with clinging?
This is one of many things that could be in this talk, which are dropped because otherwise we'd be here all night.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, it's a really important point. In Pāli, it's the panch upadana khanda, is all one word, compound. So panch is 5, pancha. Upadana khanda. Now, the Buddha says in summary, the 5 upadana aggregates are dukkha. What you notice what he did not say is the 5 aggregates are dukkha. If he said that, then we're stuffed. Basically, sometimes people say, oh, the Buddha said everything, life is suffering, everything is suffering. No, he didn't. If he said the 5 aggregates are suffering, then yeah, sure, he would have said that, but he didn't. The 5 aggregates are fine. So there's no problem with the 5 aggregates. The problem is the upadana. It's a relationship to the aggregates. That's the problem. And that's what we work on in the meditation practice. And this is what makes liberation possible. We can change our relationship. We can't change the world is what it is, but we can change our relationship to the world. And this is what he's getting at. Okay, shall we move on? Let's look at this Khanda, this aggregate business. In Pāli, the word is Khanda. It's usually translated aggregate. Khanda indicates a mass of something, and in particular, a great collection of something. So a pile of sand is a Khanda. It's one big thing, a pile of sand, consisting of many smaller units, each individual grain of sand. So it's a great mass of grains of sand. And you notice in this example that what connects the parts, the individual grains of sand, to make the whole, is these are only very loosely connected. In other words, a pile of sand is easily scattered. And this is part of the implication of the word that the Buddha's audience would have registered, which of course we don't. So taken as a collection, Khanda can also indicate a category of something. So our pile of sand sits on a beach. Everything here that can be categorized as sand, quote unquote, both the pile itself and what surrounds the pile is collected into the Khanda category, beach, quote unquote. So the Rupa Khanda, literally the body Khanda, consists of the whole mass of experiences that taken together could be characterized as body, as physical. Does that make sense? So the 5 khandas are 5 categories of experiences. Again, you notice it's always about experience. Always experience. So the Pancha Khanda, the 5 aggregates, this is a list consisting of body, feeling, perception, choices, awareness. So these are 5 categories, Khanda, that each contain a great collection, Khanda, of individual experiences that could be placed into these one or more of these 5 categories. Now, why are these 5 categories so important? Why are they so important that they merit their own list and they appear in the very first discourse? Because for the Buddha, they are the categories of experience that we appropriate as, this is mine. And why is appropriation important? Because it's an essential aspect of Atman, of self. In other words, for the Buddha, Atman, self, means something fundamentally different from what's being spoken of in the Upanishads. So for him, self, Atman, is something we construct. It's not something already given. Now, in the Upanishads and in the other Atman traditions, self is the already given primary. It's the already given starting point from which the multiplicity of the world proceeds. And the Buddha sees things in reverse. For him, what's given is the collection of individual events that make up the multiplicity of the world, which we appropriate in order to infer the existence of an Atman. But this self, this Atman for the Buddha, is not actually part of experience or directly given in experience. It's an assumption, an inference, a projection. It's a construction project. And what are the raw materials from which we construct this self? This is the list of the 5 aggregates that we appropriate, cling to, in order to construct a sense of self. Does that make sense? And this is why this particular list is important.
Patrick, I've got another question.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I'm hearing about the Buddha's constantly pointing to experience and the self is constructed. My very, very, very limited practice and reading, when I undertake inquiry or investigation in those other traditions, so looking for what is this or who is this or headless way, whatever, all of those different, it seems to arrive at the same conclusion, that the self is constructed. So my confusion from tonight's talk is experientially I get to the same place, if you like. I mean, words are really difficult. But it seems that you're saying not same.
I'm not quite. I'm saying the Buddha says not same.
Yeah.
That's the way he looks at it. So for you, it's like 6 of one, half a dozen of the other.
The investigation in any of those traditions seems to arrive at the same conclusion, that the self is a constructed concept. Yeah.
And if that's your experience, that is your experience.
Yeah.
And nobody can argue with your experience. So that approach is perfectly valid.
Yeah.
But here we're trying to work out, so where is the Buddha coming from? What's the problem that he sees? So whether one agrees with him or not, in my view, is neither here nor there. I mean, I'm not entirely sure that I agree with him. I think
I'm not entirely sure I do either.
I think I could happily practice in an Atman tradition.
Yeah.
And get to the same place.
Yeah.
But he sees certain dangers.
Yes.
Like he's flagging certain things. He's saying, wait a minute, hold on there. There's a problem here. And this problem is what we're beginning to uncover. What he thinks is the problem.
Yeah. And it seems a lot of the neo-invited teachers, or however you want to frame them, have come up, have created systems where a lot of those problems do arise in terms of, particularly relationships between male teachers and female students, et cetera. So, it seems like there's a lot of wisdom in him, I guess, challenging the structures around those traditions, maybe. Anyway,
although exactly the same problems occur in Buddhist traditions,
sure,
Christian traditions, basically anywhere where there's blokes who think they're enlightened.
Yeah, it seems though, doesn't it, to be more prevalent where there's somebody claiming guru status.
Yeah, I think it's a question of power structures, and I think that's one of the things about the Buddha. When you look at the system he created, that he tried to eliminate that as much as possible.
Yeah.
By having a much more republican system, and even in terms of the relationship of lay people to the monks and the nuns, like in traditional Buddhist societies, which are conditioned by centuries of monarchical and completely anti-democratic social structures, then you might get this hierarchical thing where the job of the lay people is to obey orders, but you don't get that in the Buddha's teaching.
Yeah.
In fact, if you look at the role of the monks and the nuns, they have zero authority over lay people, like none. So a monk or a nun, in relation to lay people, can teach, admonish, advise, encourage, inspire, etc., but cannot give orders. Can't do that. It's not part of their role. But later on, then the traditions kind of solidified. They invented hierarchies and you end up with monks owning vast estates with thousands of serfs. So,
Yeah.
that's the political structures. And one of the interesting things I think about contemporary Western Buddhism is that we're coming at this without all those structures. So it gives us an interesting, a different way of looking at things.
Thanks, Patrick.
So the raw materials from which we construct self for the Buddha, these are the 5 aggregates. So start with body, physical experience. So body gives our identity a sense of solidity as a physical form located in space. So when appropriated, when clung to, physical experience becomes my body, my seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, and this is who I am. Then we have feeling, Vedana. This is the affective aspect of experience, that which moves me or stimulates a response. So I am moved to hold and to become intimate with, to reject and distance myself from, or to ignore or be confused and doubtful about what to do. All of these responses are mine. And feeling tells me how I am. The distinctive pattern of feelings, responses, emotions that govern my emotional life. So then we get perception. This is the recognition or interpretation of any experience. What gives familiarity and meaning to an experience? So perception gives me what I am experiencing, my world within which I find myself. And notice how feeling and perception act together. Feeling provides our response to what is happening, and perception provides us with what we think is happening. So the response to feeling, the what, perception. Then we get choices. These are all choices and decisions to act. And these are appropriated to give me the sense that these are my decisions. I am the one who is making them, and I am responsible for them. And then finally, we get awareness, most intimate of all. So when we appropriate awareness, this gives me the sense that I am the one who is aware of all this. All these experiences are part of my awareness, and they refer back to me. And finally, notice that of these 5 aggregates of this particular list, one is physical and the rest are psychological, because the construction project that builds self is essentially conceptual, psychological in its nature. So self is constructed by mind from what we directly encounter. And when it emerges to the surface, it emerges as a view, ditti in Pāli, and particularly the view of the reality of the person, what's called Sakkaya Ditti. So the aggregates are what we cling to in order to construct a self living at the center of his or her world. Now, once we come to here, then we can move on to what the problem is from the Buddha's perspective. Because you notice that from his perspective, these 5 aggregates, these 5 khandas, are closely associated with dukkha. He says, in summary, the 5 aggregates associated with clinging are dukkha, or the 5 appropriated aggregates are dukkha. So this is really important because if we look at the Buddha's project, what is it? His project is, how do we cultivate a way of life without dukkha? And this is why he's so interested in self, because he feels that our construction of self gets in the way of living without dukkha. But his focus is the cessation of dukkha. So he'll talk about self and he'll talk about not self, but only to get to somewhere else. And in one discourse, the simile of the snake, Majjhima 22, he talks about how our view of self plays out in all sorts of ways. But then he gets down to what he's really interested in. He says, previously and now, what I teach is dukkha and the cessation of dukkha. That's it. So the Buddha rejects the teaching of self because for him, self and possession go together. And this is in particular a psychological self. And possession causes dukkha. That's for him the problem. So if we want our dukkha to cease, then we have to stop taking as ours what is not ours. In other words, we have to stop appropriating, stop clinging. And the 5 aggregates are important because this is what we appropriate as mine, and we use them to construct an identity that we take to be fundamentally real, against which everything is measured. Because for the Buddha, the problem is not that we construct an identity. We have to construct an identity, otherwise we can't function. And the Buddha constructed an identity. He knew precisely who he was, and he made sure that the people around him knew it. But he recognized this identity as essentially a convenience. It's a concept or a network of concepts that helped him get through the day and function well. He did not take this self as the fundamental reality and then try to bend the world to accommodate it. Instead, he took the opposite approach and he adapted his self to be able to work within the changing conditions of the world. Does that make sense? And it's one of the problems with translating anattā as no self, because then it gets, well, does it mean no identity? How do I function without an identity? Well, the answer is we can't. But we don't take this identity as the absolute primary already given and bend the world to it, which will fail. Rather, we ground ourselves in the world and adapt the identity to be able to surf the conditions. So, the Buddha is not interested in the doctrine of Atman that he inherited, because this doctrine is just a bundle of concepts referring to something beyond the world of experience, and all he's interested in is experience itself. So he rejects the metaphysical Atman that he was trained in, but more than that, he feels that any concept we have of Atman, of self, any way we have of substantiating it in the world, is bound up with drivenness and pain. And this is because of the deep ties between this is mine and I am this. This, and finally emerging as the view, this is myself. So we hold on to possessions in order to maintain an identity. And as our possessions crumble, so does our identity, and all of this creates pain. So the Buddha is trying to cut through all this philosophical stuff and get down to what's actually important. So since from his point of view, holding to our instinctive view of self necessarily causes pain, then drop it. So we get lost in our concepts about self and the drives that give it life, because it turns out that that's all that Atman, that self is. It's a bundle of concepts and drives. So from the Buddha's perspective, this self that everybody seems so concerned with has no real basis in experience and is actually the source of our troubles. And on the other hand, since self is just a bundle of concepts and drives, it provides an entry into the Buddha's examination of experience. So you believe in this self. So what's your experience of it? And then it might move on to having a belief in this self. Does it help you cultivate the wholesome and abandon the unwholesome? Or does it get in the way because at some point it encourages clinging to whatever you identify as self? So this is where he's getting at with his rejection of self and the promotion of the doctrine not self. Okay, that's it. Any questions or comments? My apologies for going on for so long and for being so technical and obscure.
Thank you, Patrick. I mean, that was pretty amazing to have it laid out in front of us with such clarity. Now, I was just thinking about the Advaita teachers and their sort of adherence to the Atman as this metaphysical, self, and the Buddha's emphasis on the experience of whatever you can experience and the not self. And I'm sort of wondering how, in order for people who adhere to Atman, the metaphysical self, I mean, they often draw on extraordinary, non-ordinary experiences that or jhanas or certain experiences to point towards, this bigger metaphysical self that that then becomes part of their self because they know that part, versus perhaps ordinary human beings don't know it yet or can never know it or whatever sort of thing. So I'm getting a bit lost and rambling, but I'm just wondering, were non-ordinary experiences that we sometimes do have in meditation, and perhaps that put too much emphasis on having them, certain bliss states that we subconsciously, once we've had them, we're striving again to have them, and again there's clinging involved and so forth, with wanting to have what we once had and possessing what we once had, and we want that feeling again, or that